Internet, there's something about the ingredients of these types of stories, and we're seeing it play out in Tennessee.
Yeah, and you know something, when I was watching the opening statements, Ted, I started to think back to cases that, shocked me the same way. Cases that I wasn't alive for, cases that the rest of the country freaked out over. And I was reminded of a case that indeed involved a mother and father. Indeed, they were hacked to death, actually, those two. And the country hung on every single word because the details were so grisly. But they could only hang on the black and white word because there was no radio and there was no television back then. And there sure as heck wasn't any internet. And yet it was the same. People still were gripped by this. And so if you've already guessed what the cases I'm talking about, it's the Lizzie Borden case. It was so famous. Look at that house. It just gives me the creeps even to see it. It was so famous. I even grew up with this like sickening nursery rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. And when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. It was like a singy song thing, which is really awful. But it was so amazing that the hold that it had over the nation propelled even into the 60s and 70s where that limerick was repeated. And it turns out, we took a look at this case and Lizzie Borden's house is for sale. What do you know? Like it just pegged right to this time that we're doing this Joel Guy case. Lizzie, by the way, was accused of it. Lizzie was acquitted of hacking her father and her stepmother to death. And strangely, Lizzie decided to stay in Falls River, Massachusetts, even though that community really ostracized her. And the house that she decided to stay in is for sale now, which is so strange. And there's no shortage of people who are absolutely intrigued by the Lizzie Borden case. I reached out to a true crime author, Harold Schechter, and I know all you Court TV fans will know who Harold Schechter is because he's written all these amazing books about really interesting true crimes. And I asked him about the how and the why. First of all, why are people so fascinated in these really, really grisly cases? And then the second one is how? Now I get it. You can read it on your phone and you get the updates, but how was it so followed back then when it was really, really hard to get that information and it would come days and days and weeks later if you were getting the newspaper on the West Coast? And he had some really interesting things to say about not only the Lizzie Borden case, but we went even further into like the Lindbergh baby and H.H. Holmes, the Chicago World's Fair serial killer, and then one of my favorites of all time, Bonnie and Clyde. Here's our conversation. Harold, the Lizzie Borden story was just gripping, and the nation hung on every word. And they didn't have TV or internet back then. How was it that it was such a huge story with so little ways to consume it?
One of the reasons it was such a huge story is Andrew Borden, who was a very, very respected member of the community, and his stepwife were savagely murdered with an axe. Then there was the leading suspect, their middle-aged daughter, Lizzie, and back then in particular, the notion that any woman was capable of committing such an atrocity seemed incredible to people, and particularly a woman like Lizzie. The case was covered very, very extensively throughout the nation. And it was also the heyday of what was called the Yellow Press, which were these pre-tabloid newspapers that contained illustrations and, often very graphic, detailed descriptions of the crime and the trial and so forth.
Even though there was no internet and television back then, no cable news 24/7, she was a little bit like the Casey Anthony of today?
Absolutely. If there had been internet back then, like Casey Anthony, there would undoubtedly have been 24/7 news coverage.
Let's talk a little bit about another case that, once again, the pages of the newspaper were voraciously consumed. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Famed aviator Charles Lindbergh, world renowned. His baby goes missing in the late evening hours, and it was day after day of coverage that just left people on the edge of their seats.
The thing that made the Lindbergh case so extraordinary was Lindbergh's own stature. We live in an age where it's very hard to believe in heroes. That wasn't true when Lindbergh made his solo crossing of the Atlantic. He went overnight from being an obscure airmail